Welcome to another Hotcakes Commerce video, an e-commerce CMS for everyone on your team. Today we're going to be talking about the new taxes provider, where you can connect to any tax provider that you would like. Before we can start working with our tax provider or building a new one, we'll first need to make sure that we have Hotcakes Commerce installed. As you can see, we have Hotcakes Commerce installed on this site, and it has some sample products added to it. And we need to also make sure that it's version 1.10 or newer, and you can see the version by going to the Hotcakes administration area and looking at the bottom of the page. There are other ways as well, but that might be the easiest. The next step to getting started is to download the Visual Studio sample solution that we have created for you. You can just go to the same downloads area that you go to for all the other supplemental downloads in the Hotcakes package. You'll find the sample tax provider in the list of links under the developer section. When you click on it, it'll take you to this page where you'll be able to see a written version of what you're looking at in the video, as well as download the package by clicking on this link. Here you can see I've downloaded the package. We have the My Taxes Provider zip file. We'll also want to open up the file location where our website is. So this is our development website, and we're in the root of it, or the first level folder of it. And so you can tell that by having a similar folder structure as you see here. So now we'll want to open up the zip file with using our favorite zip program. In this case I'm using 7-zip. It doesn't really matter which tool you use. And I'm going to just extract these folders in this file into the root of my website. This is pretty much the same thing you do with all of our extension points. When you do this successfully, you'll see the two folders and the one solution file in the root of your website like you see here. My Tax Provider, References, and My Solution Provider. If you're using multiple extension points, you may get a warning about the version number of your references. Feel free to overwrite those as long as this is a newer version. Now that we've put our project files in place, we'll want to open up those project files in Visual Studio. Just make sure that when you open Visual Studio, you open it up in administrator mode, because if you don't do that, you might have a difficult time trying to debug the code that you're writing. So I'm just going to use the Open Project option from the file menu, and I'm going to go to the location where I just extracted my files, and then I want to select the solution file, My Tax Provider, from that area. Once the project's open, we can see that our My Tax Provider solution is here, and we have the web config file, which is a reference to your existing web config in the root of your website, and then we have a number of folders that are added here. These folders are in the same structure where you would have this provider installed into your website. The root folder for your actual project files is the one that's labeled My Provider. You have a number of files available to you here. We're going to go through these files now. The first one is actually a folder, and it has an edit.ascx.resx file. And this folder is called App Local Resources. What that tells us is that this is a localization file that allows us to translate or change the static text values that are in our project. This is especially useful if we're going to have a multilingual website. The next file is edit.ascx. And this file is the file that contains the settings that you might need to allow the merchants that manage your store to edit. So those could be things like API keys and other settings that your taxes provider might require. The message box file is an optional file that you can use, and it allows you to display messages. But there's other ways to do that, so if you get rid of that file, that's perfectly fine. And for that matter, if you find that you need additional files for your project, those are allowed as well. The rest of these files are class files that allow your integration to work properly. The first class file we're going to go over is the My Tax Provider file. This is the primary file that's used to communicate between Hotcakes and your tax provider that you choose to integrate with. As you can see, it comes with some predefined code and methods and properties that you'll need to use when you do your own implementation. However, the sample code within each of the methods can be changed as you desire to meet your needs. What you see here is simply an example of how you might want to think about doing an integration. One of the things that you'll need to change is the provider ID. You'll want to change the provider ID GUID that you see here. The reason you want to change this is to make sure that it doesn't conflict with any other tax providers that might be installed on your site. You can use any number of tools to add your own GUID. There are plenty of websites that do this, as well as a GUID inserter and other tools that you can install directly into your Visual Studio environment. Another thing that you might want to consider changing is the provider name. This is a name that the merchants in your store, that manage your store, will end up seeing. And if you do change this, you'll also want to change it in the folder that you see here, the folder name for the project. Those need to match. Another thing that you might consider changing is the test connection method. This allows you to be able to test whether or not the tax provider is connecting properly with your website. This is an area that ends up being seen by merchants inside of the edit.ascx that you'll be able to manage. The next file we're going to review is the My Tax Provider Gateway. The primary difference between this one and the My Tax Provider is that this one will contain the business logic that you might want to have after the communication between your tax provider and Hotcakes occurs. So for example, after getting taxes, we might want to take this opportunity, if it succeeds, to perform some additional manipulation or changes to our line items in our order or the order itself. So in this particular case, you can see that there's a line result, and it's going to create a My Tax Provider line result, which is another file in this project, and then populate it with the relevant details. Then finally, it's going to add it to the actual result object, which is the My Tax Provider result, which is again another file in this project, and then those things will be returned, as you can see here. There's also some more GUIDs here. The Provider ID GUID, this needs to match the same Provider ID GUID that we see in the original file, class file that we just looked at. They need to be the same. However, you should put a different GUID into the Provider Gateway ID, and feel free to use the same method you did before. The reason that you change these GUID values is to ensure that you don't conflict with any other tax providers. The next class file we're going to talk about is the My Tax Provider line result. As you can see, this class only has a few properties, and these properties are populated by inserting the values that you retrieved from the tax provider that you're connecting to. As you can see, each line item only has a few values that you might need to fill in. You always want to try to be as complete as possible to make sure that the taxes are reflected accurately and that it doesn't affect accounting or your order in any way. This class is the My Tax Provider result. So this is the overall result that gets returned to the order based upon the results that you get back from your tax provider. As you know, there's plenty of values to fill in here, and again, you want to be as thorough as possible when populating this object. One of the properties that you'll see here is the items property, and as you can see, this is a list of the tax provider line result, and that's the class that we just looked at before. So this particular property will be a collection of this particular class here. Finally, the last class that we'll look at is the My Tax Provider settings class. Right now it has two properties, and these properties are simply placeholders that you would replace. The same thing with the code that you'll see in the other classes. These are all simply examples to help you get started and help you determine how this might be used in a real-world use case. This class, you'll add any number of properties that you might be saving, reading, and otherwise manipulating from the edit.ascx file that your merchants will be interacting with. This makes it very easy for you to set and get settings and use them in a fully qualified way within your code. At this point, we're going to assume that we made some changes and we're connecting to our preferred gateway. What we'll want to do next to be able to debug or otherwise interact with the code that we've written is to build our project. But before we build it, we'll want to tell it where to build. So I'm going to double click on the properties node in this project and open up the properties view. And now we can go to the build tab and then choose where the output goes when it's built. And what we want to do is choose the bin folder in the root of our website. So I'm going to navigate to the root of our website and then double click on the bin folder, and then we select that folder. That setting is done. And now we can build our project. So I'm going to build it, and you can build it any way that you're comfortable with. Once our project's built, we can verify that the build went okay by going into the bin folder and looking for our DLL. Here's the mycompany.mytaxprovider DLL. You can change the name of that within your project properties as well. Now before we can interact with and test our changes, we'll first need to deploy one more thing. In our project we had a couple of view files that we need to move into the right place. Right now, if we looked where our project is, All of our changes are currently in the My Tax Provider folder in the root of your website. So if we drill down into this, we would go into the Desktop Modules folder, Hotcakes, Core, Admin, Parts, and Tax Providers. And you may notice that these values are the same in the root of our actual website path, and they'll also match the folder structure that we see in our project solution. So I'm going to open up the My Provider folder, and we only need to move a couple things. We'll need the App Local Resources, the Edit View, and the message box if we chose to keep that. And I'm going to copy those files. In the same place within our actual website, I'm going to create a new folder, and it's going to be the same name. And within that folder, we're going to place our new files. All the other files stay where they currently are because we don't need to put the source code into deployment. When we deploy this into a live environment, we'll do it exactly the same way, except we might be using something like FTP to move the files. Now that we've moved the files, we can go ahead and test these changes and interact with them in our website. Now we're looking at the administration area of Hotcakes within your website. In order to make any changes to the taxes, we simply need to go to the Settings menu and choose the Taxes view from that menu. This is what the Taxes view looks like. We may or may not have a tax schedule in here already. Depending on the requirements of your tax integration and the tax service that you're connecting to, you may still need to create a schedule, but it may not be necessary for you to actually add any line items into it. As you can see, the default tax provider is Hotcakes. We also have Avalara's AvaTax as a default feature, an out-of-the-box feature for you to use. Or in this case, since we're wanting to use a different tax provider altogether, I have the My Provider that we just added. If we go to Edit, we can change the settings that we have in our project. Further, if our tax provider that we're integrating with allows for a test connection to be made, and if you keep the feature, we can choose to test the connection. If it's successful, you see that as a message, and because of the message box user control that's in our project, we could even style this in any number of ways. I'm going to save my changes. If we'd like to verify that the changes were saved, we can simply click Edit again and see that they were changed. Finally, we can save our changes to now start using the My Provider in our project and start testing and verifying that our code is doing what we expect. That's all that's required to be able to create your own tax provider integration. Again, the code that you use will be dependent upon the provider that you're connecting to. We'd like to thank you for viewing our video on the tax provider and invite you to see any of our other videos, and thank you again for using Hotcakes.